Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 5, Halacha 1, Part 2 of the Shir. In Part 1 of the Shir, we get a brilliancy by Rabbi Zeira about the explanation about vineyards covering a beit seah, and there's a destroyed vineyard. It gets reduced to something called a poor vineyard. It goes down to 10 vines. And within there's going to be, whichever way you look at it, according to Bet Hillel's formulation, a vineyard. That's going to be 2 by 3 with a tail. The idea is that the Tanna Kama is basically saying that if you have a vineyard, even if it gets destroyed and you're going to have these 10 vines there's going to be arrangements where you can't plant anything in the beit seah. And it really is a brilliant system of what Rabbi Zeira says the Academy is teaching in explaining this mishnah, how you're going to explain it. Now, he's saying you're ending up with 63 vines in the beit seah, and it goes down to 10 vines. Now, a beit seah is 50 amos by 50 amos, and the mishnah now is going to challenge, or the gemara is going to challenge this explanation of the mishnah that the 10 vines scattered around the beit seah is going to be by Rabbi Zeira's formulation. There might be a rejection of this by the Yerushalmi. It's unclear. The Rambam has a different take. The Chazan Ish has a different take. There are other Meforshim who have another take saying that the Yerushalmi is pointing out that it does agree. It might agree, but the math is off. But nonetheless, I think that Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yochanan kept this teaching in here because it really is brilliant and it really does force you in part 1 of the shir to start thinking about vineyards in a different way. This is going to sort of tune that up a little bit, and then in part 3 of the shir we're going to get into the alignments of vineyards. Now, I was at a Shabbos table this Shabbat and they said, so what if your vineyard is not aligned? It's a leniency. It's actually going to be better because now you're going to end up with you'll be able to plant things, other species closer together. And this isn't that great, right? And I said, no, not really, because what's going to happen is, like, let's say you have a beit seah of land and your vineyards are all out of order. Well, it's not really a leniency because now your yield goes down, right? Now you're not able to fully utilize your land. You're not able to maximize your land. Your root balls on the trees are going to have overlap, which means it's going to steal nutrition from one another. And that actually ends up with lower quality grapes and vines. So all of this is trying to go towards something saying that, look, in the vineyard, you have the beit seah. It's been reduced through some destructive event down to 10 vines, and they don't want you planting in the beit seah. And this, I think, is going to be a D'Rabbanan thing. You can look in chapter 1 in Shvius about what is going to be a field of trees, an orchard. And there they say that it's going to be 10 trees, although that's going to be organized in 2 rows of 5. But the idea is that it's trying to also maximize the nutrition of the land. I think if they're going to be looking at a D'Rabbanan reason why you can't plant in the beit seah, even if the math is a little bit off on Rabbi Zeira's formulation, which we're going to get into, I think you can hang your hat on that because they're saying, look, anyway, an orchard is 10 trees per beit seah. So don't get dissuaded that the math is off. I think this could be in here because it's a brilliancy, and it really is worth looking at, in the Art Scroll in page 44 to try to look at this because it's so smart. It really does sharpen your mind to think about vineyards in a richer way. So the Gemara is going to try to challenge Rabbi Zeira's coverage of the beit seah. Again, he has that there's 63 vines. It's going to be 9 by 7 rows, 9 rows by 7 rows. And the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Zeira's description, the vines are found to be spread over the area of 64 amos by 48 amos. Now, a beit seah is 50 by 50. So the idea is that Rabbi Zeira's vineyard is going to be 14 amos longer than the beit seah, and 2 amos narrower than the beit seah if you're going to go by his formulation to try to fit things in. In other words, you have to squeeze in some space. Now, according to Rabbi Zeira, this mishnah is dealing with a vineyard that originally contained 9 rows by 7 rows. And the normal vineyard is going to be planted at 4 amma intervals. Now, if you're going to go do that, this kind of vineyard is only going to be 32 amos by 24 amos. So that actually doesn't work out because we're told it's a beit seah. So perhaps there are actually going to be 8 intervals, and perhaps, it's going to be, 8 amos instead of 4 amos. But then the problem with that is that you end up with a 64 amos by 48 amos vineyard. And we're told that it's a beit seah. So even if after you start removing the rows of vines, the remaining vines are now going to be spread up at 16 amma intervals. And that's going to include the trunks. So at this distance, the vines are going to be treated as one combined vineyard. And although the Gemara is going to say that accepted halacha is going to be where they're going to combine only if they're spaced with intervals of less than 8 amos. According to Rabbi Zeira, the Mishnah follows the opinion of the Tanakama, and even according to the Tanakama, vines spaced more than 8 amos apart will combine only when they jointly constitute a large vineyard of at least 3 rows. So in Rabbi Zeira's case, although there are not 3 rows of real vines, nevertheless, the vines constitute a large vineyard because of the additional tail vines and the imaginary vines that we're adding. So the Chazan Ish says about this that the vines combine even if they are planted at intervals of up to 16 amos. But there comes another problem. So even if you're going to say that, okay, you're not doing a normal vineyard of 4 amos spacing between this vine and that vine, because you're down to 32 amos by 50 amos, and again, a beit seah is 50 by 50. They're saying, well, wait a second. If you're up at 8 amma intervals, and now you're taking out the in-between rows, now you're at 16. But there's going to come another problem with that. In other words, the problem is that when you go through the math to get it to fit onto 50-50 and not to have too much overage, the problem is that you're going to end up with a problem where you actually go up to almost 18 amos in real term spacing on some of these vines. And what do you do now where some of the spacing now is more than 16 amos? So, keep in mind, the 16 amos is already a d'Rabbanan thing. And now if you're going to say, well, 17.6 amos, that's going to be something where it's like, well, you're going to have a d'Rabbanan and a d'Rabbanan over the beit seah. And if you're looking at it with another organization for planting, then you have this area that has to be rearranged. And again, you're at 64 amos by 48 amos instead of 50 amos by 50 amos. So how do you do it? Where does the extra amos go on either side? How do you make it longer? And how are you doing it where you're making this shorter and you're still fitting things in to organize this 10 vine vineyard, this poor vineyard? So the Gemara says remove a 2 amos swath from here, in other words, from this extra 14 amos of length, and place it here along the vineyard sides to extend the width by 2 amos. And what this is trying to say, according to the Vilna Goan, is that the swath of land cannot actually be moved. The Gemara is merely using this method to compare the area of Rabbi Zeira's vineyard to that of a beit seah. So, according to the Vilna Goan, when Rabbi Yonah is asking about this, it's not a question about whether 2 imaginary vines are going to be added to a single tail vine, but whether we're going to give a tail to a small vineyard to make it large. And, again, how do you start, even looking at any of this? It all is going to be dealing with a large vineyard. And again, this is dealing with a small vineyard that you're now making large with imaginary vines. And now you're talking about moving around these spots, of land to get this to try to fit to be close to a beit seah. Now, the Gemara, I know what you're thinking right now. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say that it emerges that the strip of 48 amos by 2 amos removed from the length of the vineyard is fitted into the 48 amos on the side of the vineyard, thereby bringing 48 amos of it to the width of the bet seah. So what this is trying to say is that there's a missing area, and when it gets added, deducted from one side and added to the side, a simple reading of the Gemara could lead somebody to think that the vineyard is 48 amos by 48 amos. But that's not true because, again, it's supposed to be 50 amos. So it means that the 48 amos strip is added to the 48 amos section of the vineyard's length. And what's happening is where we're taking off a little bit from over here and adding it a little bit over there, and the bet seah is not really complete because we're still missing spots within it. And, it's not going to actually be 50 by 50, right? So how do you deal with this to try to make this to start to fit? Forget about the layout of the vines. That's what we covered in part 1. Now we're looking at the layout of the bet seah to try to figure out how to handle it. So the Gemara is going to try to figure out what do we do with this 50 by 50 amos. And it says, remove one additional section from among the 12 amos surplus in the length of Rabbi Zeira's vineyard, which remains at 14 amos after the 2 amos strip was removed. And that's going to equal the area of the missing corner for an area of 2 amos by 2 amos and 4 square amos. And then the Gemara says, and place this section taken from among the surplus length to complete the 50 amma by 50 amma bet seah. So you're literally cutting and pasting and rearranging the area of Rabbi Zeira's vineyard to create a bet seah, and it becomes apparent that this vineyard, even when you're going through this process, ends up being bigger than a regular bet seah by 572 square amos. And the mishnah is stating that 10 vines are going to be arranged in an area of a bet seah, not a bet seah plus 572 square amos. So how is he getting to there? In other words, when you're going through the original formulation that Rabbi Zeira has, and you go through the math, then Rabbi Zeira's vineyard is going to be 64 by 48 amos. That's 3,072 square amos. And a regular bet seah is 50 by 50, which is 2,500. So right off the bat, if you're taking, some from the north side and you're putting it onto the other side, you're still going to end up where there's a difference between 3,072 square amos and 2,500 square amos, which is going to be 572 square amos. Rabbi Zeira's 64 amma long vineyard is going to be 14 amos longer than a 50 amma length bet seah. And then you have over there this surplus on the north side, the length side, and you're a little bit shorter on the width. And even if you're moving over from the top side to the side, you're still going to end up with a surplus because you didn't take anything away. All you did is move from here to there to fit in vines, but you still end up with a surplus of area. So they want to understand, what on earth is Rabbi Zeira doing with this? What do we do with any of this? So to resolve this difficulty, the Gemara is going to try to look at the bet seah measured in that the mishnah is not going to include the 4 corners of the vineyard. In other words, when we go through Rabbi Zeira's formulation, he's saying, look, we're ending up where we have to take out the corners of the vineyard, okay? And the only planted strips in order to get Bet Hillel's, 2 by 3 with a tail, where no matter which direction you're looking, there's a 2 by 3 area with a tail there, both in the north, east, west, and south. And how do you do that? You have to take out the corners. And so now we're going to say, well, wait a second. Maybe this bigger Rabbi Zeira vineyard is not using the corners at all. And maybe we can get to a bet seah there. Maybe, okay, fine. Maybe if you're taking out the corners, maybe it's not going to be 50 by 50, but maybe it'll end up with the same square footage or the same square amos-age. And you end up, where you're the same. Maybe that's what the mishnah is talking about. So what happens with the math if you're going to clear out the corners and now you're going to look at the square amos within this? Is that now going to end up at 2,500 square amos? So the Gemara is going to try to subtract the corners, and it's going to go through the math again. It's going to say that each corner clearing situated outside the vineyard measures 16 amos by 16 amos. That's 256 square amos. And by the way, we're taking that out anyway in the original clearing of these vineyards. We have to take out the corners. And why? Because we can't have a tail of a tail. So if you're taking out the corners and you're leaving everything else in, even though there's going to be overages, you go down by 256 square amos. So the four corner areas together on each corner is going to be 256, and each one times 4 is 1,024 square amos. So if the actual area of Rabbi Zeira's vineyard is going to be 3,072 square amos, which is 64 amos by 48 amos, and now you're subtracting out 1,024 amos from the corners, then you're at 2,048 amos. But the problem is a bet seah is 2,500 square amos. And so then the area of Rabbi Zeira's vineyard is actually going to be smaller than a bet seah by 452 amos. And so that also is a problem. So if you're going to do it that way, you end up with something that's too small. So the mishnah is talking about a bet seah. What do we do with this? So the Gemara is going to note that there are grounds to reckon the area of the vineyard by extending beyond the outer vines, and it's going to give another way to try to look at this. So the Gemara says the vineyard's 4 amma work area can serve to extend the vineyard 8 amos in the north-south directions and 8 amos in the east-south directions. Now, how would that work, right? So basically, you're taking what we have from the first part of the shear, and now what you're doing, so what was that talking about? That was talking about 48 amos by 64 amos. We're 14 amos too long, we're 2 amos too short. And what do you do now? It's saying, what if we create a 4 amma buffer strip? We're going to take out the corners and we're going to add a 4 amma buffer strip. Is that going to get it so that we're at a bet seah like what the mishnah is talking about? So the Gemara is going to calculate that regardless of the vineyard area, it doesn't correspond still even with the mishnah's bet seah. So the Gemara says, how do you, so it says the vineyard's 4 amma work area can extend the vineyard 8 amos in the north-south direction, and that would take it up to 72 amos and 56 amos. And now you're still taking out the corners. And it says, how do you reckon the area of the vineyard now? Do you mean to include both the vineyard and the surrounding 4 amma work area as this bet seah? Or do you include the vineyard itself without the 4 amma work area within the bet seah? And the Gemara is trying to say, well, maybe there's another way to solve this measurement and to still get there and still get something that is close to the bet seah that the Mishnah talks about. So the questions coming up here is, are there any tools that we can use to get Rabbi Zeira's vineyard to fit the Mishnah's bet seah, which is 50 amos by 50 amos, or 2,500 square amos? And is there some system that we have where we can add a 4 amma work area within the bet seah that surrounds the destroyed area and also excludes the corners? Is that going to work? So the Gemara says, how do you reckon the area of the vineyard? Do you mean to include both the vineyard and the surrounding 4 amma work area within the bet seah? Or do you include only the vineyard itself without the 4 amma work area within the bet seah? And the calculation is going to come up saying that you can't find a way to correspond to the 2,500 square amos. Because it says like this in the Mishnah. It says, if you reckon the area of the vineyard with both the vineyard and the 4 amma work area inside the bet seah, and by the way, the corners are still taken out, then it emerges, says this Gemara, that the Mishnah's bet seah measurement is deficient by 508 square amos in relation to the size of the vineyard. And the next problem comes up like this. And if you reckon the area of the vineyard without the 4 work area, it emerges that the Mishnah's bet seah measure exceeds the measure of the actual vineyard by 452 square amos. So how does Rabbi Zeira's statement, his own statement, that the Mishnah is talking about this formula with Rabbi Zeira talking about 63 vines in the vineyard and there are 9 by 7. He didn't get this from nowhere. This is a tradition that he's getting. How does he get this? And how do you make this add up to what the Mishnah is saying about being 50 by 50 amos? So how is Rabbi Zeira going to end up getting his case to fit with the Mishnah's case that these 10 vines are spread over the bet seah? The Gemara is going to come up with 2 other ways to try to do the math and try to get this difficulty to get sorted out. In other words, how do you arrange this to end up where you're talking about these 10 vines on a bet seah? Because the Mishnah talks about it. So the Gemara says that if you can't say that the Mishnah's bet seah refers only to the vineyard proper and suggests that the Mishnah deals with a case where the vines are distanced further than 17 amos, because then the vines would be judged as a collection of individual vines rather than a vineyard. In other words, if you're going to say, well, maybe we could do this by saying we still have a bet seah and we're just going to distance them more than 16 amos. But then the problem with that is to say, well, the problem with that is these are individual vines. This is not a vineyard. And the Gemara, is going to continue. It's going to say, if you're going to say that the Mishnah includes the work area to this calculation as well, but deals with a case where he placed the original vines more than 16 amos apart, then I will respond that we learn in our Mishnah only that 10 vines to a bet seah combine to constitute a vineyard. And what does that indicate? It says that if the vines are spread out over an area of more than a bet seah, they don't combine. And if the vines that are being dealt with in this Mishnah are not spread out to their maximum, then they're going to end up being more than 16 amos. And the problem is we're talking about a bet seah, so we're talking about where either the land is fully utilized and now your vines are spread out more than 16 amos, or if you're saying, okay, we're going to leave it at 16 amos, then you don't fully utilize the bet seah. And the Gemara says, the Mishnah says, we're talking about a bet seah. So again, why is the Mishnah stipulating 10 vines to be confined to a bet seah? And this is something that the Chazan Ish grapples with, Rabbi Kanievsky grapples with, the Vilna Goan grapples with it. And if you're going to say that instead of a 16 amma intervals, the remaining vines are distanced at 14.3 amos intervals, and then you're going to also add in the work area of 4 amos, well, you can get to a spacing that's going to be bigger than 16 amos, but the total area then grows, and you end up adding up to 65 amos by 50 amos. Now you're ending up with 33.18 amos. So the problem is that you're ending up with, in that kind of case, 800 too many amos, 800 square amos too many. The other problem is if you're just going to distance the vines without the work area, then you're going to distance it at 17.68 amos. That's bigger than 16 amos. Now, we learned before that if it's going to be 16 amos or more away, more than 16 amos away, it's just an individual vine. So this never was a legal vineyard. And then, you could just plant within it 6 tefachim, and that's not what this Mishnah is talking about. Vilna Goan says that this Mishnah is talking about a destroyed vineyard, and it's going to retain the legal status of a vineyard where the perimeter, you have to distance between foreign plants 4 amos, and you can't plant anything within this bet seah space. So how do you organize it? The Vilna Goan goes on to do other setback issues and other setback formulations, and the Chazan Ish rejects that. He says that doesn't work either. So the Gemara is going to finish this up, and it's going to say, hence, we cannot learn the Mishnah as referring to a vineyard that was planted and then destroyed, like what Rabbi Zeira is saying. In other words, if you have 10 vines and they're planted how Rabbi Zeira talks about, where you're talking about 63 vines that are now taken away, then either you're ending up where you're too close and you didn't fully utilize the beit seah, or your beit seah is too big. You have too many vines and you're over the space. And now if you're going to be cutting away vines, either you're still under the space or you're over the space. You're not getting to a beit seah. It's really unclear. Some people will say that that Rabbi Zeira's approach still works. Some will say that actually the Yerushalmi is rejecting Rabbi Zeira's approach, and the Rosh is going to actually be following Rabbi Zeira's approach. The Rambam has a different approach. You can see this in Hilchos Kilayim 7:8. Bnei Moshe, by the way, also uses this approach. And he's not citing Rabbi Zeira's interpretation of this mishnah at all. He's saying that the Yerushalmi does reject Rabbi Zeira's approach completely, but he's going to explain this as follows. Because again, how do we deal with this mishnah talking about 10 vines? Okay, Rabbi Zeira comes and brings an approach, and the Rambam says like this: a simple reading of the mishnah suggests that when a vineyard is destroyed, as long as there remains 10 vines dispersed throughout a beit seah, and 5 of these 10 vines could be fitted into a 2-facing, 2 and 1 with a tail configuration, in other words, 2 and 3, like what Bet Hill is saying, then we consider all the remaining vines as part of the vineyard, and we prohibit the entire beit seah for planting of foreign seed. Now, Rabbi Zeira is disputing this interpretation and is attempting to limit the Mishnah's ruling to a case where all 10 vines can be configured as having a tail. But the Rambam is saying as long as one of these is going to be with a tail, and you have 5 of them, and even if 5 of them are not, then that's going to be enough. So, Rabbi Zeira's approach is an interesting one. It's kept in here to try to teach us. It's a maloket as to whether that's going to be the halacha, or perhaps it's going to be something like what the Chazan Ish is working on with alternatives to setbacks, or perhaps it's going to be like what the Rambam says, where even if there's just going to be 5 of those vines that can be made like Bet Hillel's vineyard, that's going to be enough, and then the other vines are going to combine. What is that suggesting, by the way? In the Rambam's suggestion of this poor vineyard, that basically you might have some vines that are going to be longer and further away than the 16 amos. And he's basically saying that as long as you can draw a circle around this beit seah, you're not allowed to plant within this beit seah, not allowed to plant foreign species. And if that's really going to be the reading of the Rambam, and that's really going to be the halacha, then that's going to be a rabbinic restriction to further tighten up and to create a fence to make sure that nothing's planted within what could be deemed to be a vineyard. And, we could go back to the Rosh and, say that, well, maybe the math is a little bit off on Rabbi Zeira, but Rabbi Zeira's approach might still be the approach that actually works. Okay, fine, some of the vines are going to be in a space more than 50 by 50 amos, or maybe you're a little bit off, either lower or too high if you're taking out the corners and measuring that way. But maybe Rabbi Zeira's approach really does work. We just don't know. And in part 3 of this year, we're going to get back to alignments of vineyards and making sure we have rational vineyards, because again, we want to maximize our land, our nutrition from the land, and the nutrition each plant gets. Those are not necessarily the same things. And also, we want to get the most yield. We want to protect the farm. So we don't want to have these chaotic vineyards. And we're going to get into that in part 3. Have a great day.